Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Happy Friday. Thanks for spending some time with us. This is a really important meeting for the group that together is called PSENF, which is a terrible acronym, but that's the way we do things here. I just want to kick things off and I was thinking this morning, if you're like me, you probably have in your kitchen some kitchen gadget that you bought or was given as a gift. And at the time you thought, that's a really cool idea. I'm going to do that. I'm going to use this thing, right? So for me, it's a cannoli gun. It's the thing that you would put in. I was going to make cannolis, and somebody gave it to me, and I thought I've never made a cannoli before, but I like cannolis, and I'm going to start making these things. That tool has sat in my drawer for years. I used it once. Turns out I'm not very good at making cannolis, and I didn't really have a demand for cannolis. So you probably have something like that, either in your workshop or in your kitchen or in your tool shed. This project is about building a tool or a family of tools to help us understand how Puget Sound works, and more importantly, a tool that allows us to evaluate management options in Puget Sound. We're about a little over 2/3 of the way through a project that was funded by the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation. And it's a distinctive project for us because it allows us to be creative and to take some chances and to develop a model. This is an important day for us because we want to put our tool in its current form in front of you all and have an open, blunt discussion about whether or not you're going to use this tool to make cannolis or anything else, right? So we have a really talented group of people that are on our team, and we have about a year of funding to do whatever we want to do, which is a really cool opportunity for those of us who are work on funded research projects. So today is all about getting feedback from you as individuals, from you representing organizations or implementation strategies, or however you want to think of this. And the way that we're thinking of this is a year from now, this project will be finishing. Now, of course, model development work continues and will go on, for a long period of time. But contractually, and just sort of thinking about the opportunities we have about a year of time to do some more development, testing, demonstration of this suite of models. And we're not, we don't think that should be us deciding in isolation, like what model runs we should do, how we should exercise this. So by next year, we want to have a family of products that come out of these models that we're building that will excite you. It'll excite you and your groups and the kinds of things that you can take back, and we can come with you and get different parts of the Puget Sound Restoration Program excited about using these integrated models. So for today, what we would like is your help to align our efforts in model development, testing, initial runs kind of thing. Align those efforts with where you see your needs are. And specifically, we're looking for the ability for marching orders from you and your groups so that we can effectively spend our time over the next 12 months or so. So that's what we're all about. We're not here today to develop specific scenarios or to I have a problem. I need, I have a presentation next month. I need you to run the model to solve a problem for me. That's not what we're about today. What we're about is trying to figure out what would be the most illustrative things we could do with these models and modifications to the models so that in time from about a year from now, you're super jazzed about using them. That we're not the cannoli gun in the drawer, that we're that paring knife that you use every day. The other thing I'll say is recognize not everyone's going to use this model every day, right? So identifying what the utility of the model is and how it gets used is what we're about today. So my request is that you are honest with you're direct with us and be blunt. It's perfectly fine to say, I will never use this model. This is just, I don't see an application of this in what I do. That's fine. But if you can say, yeah, this is interesting, and can you do this, or would you be able to do this, or can we talk about it this way? Then I'm interested. That's the place where we want to be in this conversation. So with that, again, thank you all for attending. I know time is precious and it's Friday morning. So we'll try to be efficient and try to have some fun here. And with that, I'm going to pitch it over to my colleague, Caitlin Motto.
Thanks, Joel. And again, thank you all for being here today. We're going to be having some, challenging and in-depth conversations and discussion, but first we would just want to kind of set up the framing for this project a little bit more specifically, especially for folks who haven't engaged with us yet to this point. So in Puget Sound, as you all know, we're facing stressors that originate from human actions and climate change and population growth and development that are stressing our Puget Sound system and both the ecological and social factors that we depend on a daily basis. And a major challenge is to understand how both the current and the future conditions of population growth and climate change and our decisions to manage them, how those decisions and stressors will affect the interconnected natural and human system, and how we can minimize trade-offs across multiple regional recovery goals. The impacts of these stressors are far-ranging and complex in coastal estuarine systems like Puget Sound. And so we need tools to help us understand the impacts of these stressors and our decisions to manage them. We hope that the Puget Sound Integrated Modeling Framework, or PSIMF, will be one of those tools, like Joel just mentioned. But we need this tool to focus on high-level, regional, watershed scale challenges, solutions, and strategies. So what does this tool actually look like? So like Joel mentioned, PSIMF is a suite of existing modeling tools for the region. We're lucky in Puget Sound to have these existing models that were poised to be integrated with one another, to be linked together into a suite of models. So the first model in our chain, perhaps, or our cycle, is the land cover change model. This model has been developed at the Puget Sound Institute, and it is a terrestrial growth and development model. Basically, it tracks changes in land cover over time, projects them into the future. So the land cover change model, tracking changes in land cover, can then pass that information about land cover to VELMA. VELMA is a terrestrial eco-hydrological model that simulates watershed hydrology and biogeochemical processes. It can help us track fate and transport of nutrients and contaminants within watersheds at a very granular scale, basically, flow paths throughout the basin, but also can be scaled up to large watersheds and ultimately the Puget Sound Basin scale. So then from VELMA, we get information about nutrient loads, toxic loads, and freshwater flow into Puget Sound. So that information can then be passed to the Salish Sea Model. This is an estuarine and marine circulation and biogeochemical model that tracks the fate and transport of that freshwater nutrients and toxics, as well as the ocean boundary in Puget Sound, circulates and transforms those constituents, and then can pass information about temperature, toxics, nutrients, and plankton to Atlantis, which is a food web and end-to-end ecosystem model. Lest we forget, Puget Sound is both an ecological and a social system. So at the center of these biophysical models is also information about humans in the Puget Sound region, our well-being, economic vitality, and equity. So factors from the biophysical models can help us to inform also the condition of the human system, both in quantitative but also in qualitative terms. Information about housing density and land conversion, drought, water quality, and fisheries harvest. So now I'll give a little bit more information about each of the individual models, and in particular, the advancements that have been made in model development that were motivated by the PSIMF project. So that first model in our chain, the land cover change model, essentially uses statistical modeling to derive past land cover trends from the National Land Cover Database, or NLCD, and then projects them forward into the future. Given the past trends there, and then given the past trends in land cover change, but also population projections and other relevant spatial features on the landscape, such as the locations or distance to urban growth areas, industrial centers, major roads or transportation features, etc. So then we can use this model to project forward the status quo, but also deviations from the status quo, or kind of alternatives to how land cover change might proceed in the region. Here's just a quick video kind of visualizing the parcel scale changes that are projected by the land cover change model. This model projects annual changes in land cover, but right here, this video is just showing decadal changes in one specific region of Puget Sound. I'm going to play that one more time just so you can kind of watch those transitions happening. This represents kind of a status quo future, but like I mentioned, we can also do alternative conditions designed by altering the historical relationships between transitions and those relevant spatial features in the model. So for example, we could adjust the probability of transitions relative to urban growth areas or riparian areas to basically simulate alternative futures for how land cover change proceeds. We could also ramp up or down population growth and see how that influences the probability of land cover transitions into the future. Next is VELMA. And like I've mentioned, VELMA is an eco-hydrological terrestrial model. There has been a significant amount of work by the VELMA team in the last year and a half or so to parameterize and calibrate VELMA for 24 watersheds in Puget Sound. They're shown in the map here at a 30-meter, a very fine scale 30-meter grid. This model will allow us to, and then a linkage to the land cover change model will allow VELMA to account for dynamic land cover change over time. There has also been advancements to integrate a new soil data set called SOLIS, which will allow VELMA to improve the performance of flow in the model, as well as a new septics data set from USGS, which we hope will improve the modeling of nutrient loads, particularly in rural areas where there are a lot of septic systems. And then also work to downscale and blend both historical and future climate projections to improve how VELMA accounts for future climate change. And I'll just say a bit more about that climate data set now. So we are using, at least currently, we're using a high emissions scenario from the CMIPS 5 climate change projection. So this represents the representative concentration pathway, or RCP 8.5, which is a future projection of our emissions and represents kind of the high emissions scenario. So what does that mean for Puget Sound? We have statistically downscaled those future climate projections based on RCP 8.5 to the Puget Sound region, and can account for changes in precipitation patterns, temperature, etc. And what we're seeing for Puget Sound is that by mid-century, so about 2050, summers could be up to 6 degrees Celsius warmer. We might see above freezing temperatures year round, which will result in no spring snowpack in certain areas, and then overall less precipitation. So it's important to capture these both regional and fine scale differences in temperature and precipitation, snow versus rain, because that will have, we believe, will have important influences on flow and temperature in the streams, which will then influence circulation and productivity and kind of timing of different factors in Puget Sound. The next model is the Salish Sea Model. This is our hydrology and biogeochemistry model of Puget Sound and the Salish Sea. So the Salish Sea Model has worked to integrate and validate the use of the VELMA-based flow, temperature, and nutrients. Previously, the Salish Sea Model typically uses a regression-based approach developed by the Department of Ecology, where they calculate nutrient loads as a regression against river flows. So instead, they'll be using the VELMA-based flows, nutrients, and temperature. The Salish Sea Model also has recently produced a toxics module, and specifically they are using this toxics module for PCBs. So being able to calculate fate and transport of PCBs around Puget Sound, both in the water column and the sediments. And then also the Salish Sea Model team has worked to prepare those climate change forcings for both the atmosphere and the ocean based on CMIP 5 and the same RCP 8.5 emissions scenario that the VELMA team is using. And then the Atlantis model, this is the food web and ecosystem model. Atlantis models 79 functional groups, both vertebrates, invertebrates, birds, as well as some habitats, including seagrass and kelp. The outputs from the model include information about biomass, the spatial distribution and diet of different species, abundances and condition. And so a lot of information contained about the food web, the behavior distribution of different species in Puget Sound. You can see an example here of herring biomass distributed around Puget Sound based on Atlantis simulation for just 1 year. This is 2011. So what Atlantis has worked on for the last about year and a half is integrating forcing from the Salish Sea Model for nutrients, plankton, and then also physical factors such as salinity and temperature. This represents a higher resolution, both spatially and temporally, of forcing to Atlantis. They've also worked to integrate the thermal response, basically bioenergetics of fish, as well as minimum oxygen thresholds for fish. So both of these will allow us to capture more explicitly the influence of temperature and oxygen on fish performance and behavior in the model. They have also integrated a contaminant submodel, again, kind of targeting our ability to model the influence and bioaccumulation of PCBs on the food web. And then also, we'll talk more about this in just a minute, but the integration of freshwater conditions on salmon production and capacity via an integration between the VELMA terrestrial eco-hydrological model and a model called HARP, which models the influence of freshwater conditions on the salmon life history stage. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Hem to talk more about this integration between VELMA, HARP, and Atlantis.
Thank you, Caitlin. I'm Hemnalini Morsalia Luna. I'm an ecosystem modeler with Long Live the Kings, and I'm part of the Atlantis modeling team. So as Caitlin has been describing in terms of how the different models interact with each other, what we're going to focus on is where the salmon modeling salmon population falls, because we know many of you are really interested in salmon, and it's such an important, they're such important key populations. So the salmon life cycle as part of SIMF is modeled within Atlantis. I'm going to talk more in detail about how the different stages are modeled, but it happens here in Atlantis. So the different outputs, different changes that are coming through the land cover change model into the watershed, into the Salish Sea Model, and then are going to affect the different biological processes that are happening in Atlantis in the food web. But we know that there's also changes that are happening at the landscape scale in the watershed that we are not necessarily capturing with that loop. So what we're doing is using this habitat assessment and restoration planning model to affect recruitment of salmon. So the actual smolts that will go from the river and then move into Puget Sound. We're going to affect how that production happens through this linkage. Next, please. So this is the salmon life history in Atlantis. The green processes are the ones that happen in the marine system and are modeled explicitly in our model domain. And the blue ones don't actually happen within the model structure because the polygons only cover Puget Sound, but we are still modeling it, as you can think of it, as a black box where those processes are happening. So both the river stage and the Pacific Ocean stage, but we do model the whole life cycle within the ecosystem model. Next. So Atlantis has 26 salmon functional groups. We model Chinook, coho, chum, pink, and sockeye. We do not include steelhead. And we model both wild and hatchery populations. So hatcheries are forced. They don't go through the usual biological processes for recruitment. And then we also have both migratory and resident groups. So the migratory groups come from the river, cross through Puget Sound, go to the ocean, and as functional groups are independent of the populations that stay within Puget Sound. So like the resident Chinook. And the reason we did this is to make sure that we are, when we do the contaminant modeling, that we're able to really simulate what's going on with those resident fish. Next. We model the different food web linkages between salmon and all the other species in the system. Here in blue, you can see those are on salmon, and each of those lines shows the different predator-prey interactions that are included in Atlantis. Next. We also modeled spatial distribution. Salmon spatial distribution happens monthly, and it's derived from surveys, and the actual spatial distributions were derived using a geostatistical modeling approach on that survey data and validated through expert knowledge. And within Atlantis, salmon are also targeted by both commercial and recreational fisheries. We have 60 separate fishing fleets, and we have separated the salmon fisheries in both tribal and non-tribal fisheries to allow us to do more detailed representation and scenarios. Next. And the recruits, so the production of smolts for the wild salmon in Atlantis uses a beverage and hold relationship in the base model. And something that's really, curve is really important because it's what we're using to then link to the habitat changes that are informed by VELMA and that tell us how that number of recruits or smolts is going to change because of those different habitat changes. Next. So just going back to this diagram, basically this linkage sidesteps the salmon life cycle effect. So it adds another layer where we're taking the habitat changes that are coming from VELMA, using this model to interpret those changes and translate them into changes in how many recruits are going to come in Atlantis. Next. So this is the Habitat Assessment and Restoration Planning Model, and it's run by Team Beachy's group at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. And in Puget Sound, it's available for the Snohomish and the Stillaguamish River. So this model takes different restoration actions or different effects. So for example, wood abundance, amount of riparian shade. It figures out how those different restoration actions could affect habitat conditions. And then it calculates a series of multipliers that affect the different, that would affect the different life stages of salmon. So this specifically capacity and productivity. Next, please. So this diagram just shows the whole linkage in a little more detail. So what I was just mentioning in terms of changing the parameters in the in productivity and capacity, those parameters then are used to modify the Beverton-Holt curve that determines how many recruits are coming into the marine system. And that happens in Atlantis and then affects the whole life cycle. And then at the same time, we're having the effects of other factors that are coming through, for example, nutrients that are coming from VELMA through the Salish Sea Model and are affecting other life stages and other processes of the salmon's life history at the same time. Thank you, Caitlin.
Thanks, Hem. Okay, so the last part of our PSIMF model suite is the human systems and our understanding of both the influence of ecological conditions on the social system. So it's important for PSIMF to capture this dynamism of this system as well, but it represents a modeling challenge. So compared to the natural system, the human system is much harder to describe with things like equations and functions, and harder to connect mathematically to the other models in the framework, which are dealing with flows of water and nutrients and salmon, etc. So we're still working out exactly what this aspect of the project will look like. But there are several options, and we think we will hopefully pursue both of these in some capacity. So the first option would be basically a qualitative model. So we could boil down the quantitative models into a more simplistic qualitative model where we're connecting aspects of the biophysical, terrestrial, and freshwater and marine systems into the most important components. And then there are links between them. And the nature of the links would simply be a positive or a negative connection. And then we could link these terrestrial, freshwater, and marine components to components of the human system, aspects of well-being and governance, sense of place, economic vitality. And then evaluate that network or simulate it using randomly selected interaction strengths for each of the links. And then we can evaluate those simulations of the network to their responses to a perturbation, such as increasing temperature, decreasing freshwater flow, decreasing snowpack, etc. And see how both the biophysical nodes or components in the network, but also how the human system responds to those perturbations. We can evaluate the response of the qualitative model to and the biophysical aspects of the qualitative model to the responses that we are observing using the quantitative biophysical models, and kind of gut check the performance of the qualitative model against the quantitative model. But and then also on top of that, understand how the human system is responding to these changes in the biophysical system. So that's one option that we're pursuing. Another that we're interested in is performing some economic analyses. So in economics, things can have market value. Basically, we can observe the influence of changes through the market system in dollars and cents, such as fishery revenue. But also we can observe the impact of environmental conditions on things like property value. So observing how property value or land sale value changes in response to drought, for example, or wildfire risk. And then we can project those changes forward based on outcomes from the biophysical model to understand how market values change. Another option for economic analyses would be a non-market value, something like the existence value for salmon, or aspects of quality of life or sense of place that don't necessarily have a value in the market, but have an inherent value or influence on our lives. So and something like that would be elicited through perhaps a survey, like a willingness to pay survey or a willingness to act survey, where members of the public, residents of Puget Sound, would rate their willingness to pay for different aspects of the system. So those are some options that we are thinking with respect to modeling or understanding the influence of changing biophysical conditions on the human system. I saw some questions in the chat related to spatial resolution of the different models. So we thought it would be helpful to share this kind of a big picture snapshot of where the different models are operating in the spatial domain. So the land cover change model covers, shown on the left here, covers 18 watersheds where we're likely to see most of the development and changes in land cover resulting from population growth and development. VELMA is being modeled for kind of the primary 24 watersheds in Puget Sound, in the Puget Sound Basin. The Salish Sea Model covers the Puget Sound, but also the Strait of Juan de Fuca and the Strait of Georgia and much of the coastal zone here in the Pacific Northwest. But the outputs from the Salish Sea Model will be run at this full scale, but Atlantis covers only the main Puget Sound basins. So just the information from kind of the Puget Sound basins will be passed to the Atlantis model because its domain is spatially located in those main Puget Sound basins. So that's the kind of spatial resolution of the different models. And then now that we have this integrated model suite, the models are kind of talking to each other. We've tested our ability to pass information from one model to the next. There's real value in using this integrated model suite to synthesize decades of terrestrial, freshwater, and marine information and understand the cumulative and interactive effects of multiple threats like population growth and climate change, and use them to identify comprehensive solutions of across both social and ecological objectives. So we hope you see that value in the PSINF modeling framework. And now that we've done that technical linking, we're poised to ask these large ecosystem scale questions about management interventions that are needed to mitigate the impacts of population growth and climate change, and ultimately move us towards Puget Sound recovery. So that's what we're going to spend the bulk of the rest of this time together, is kind of brainstorming and discussing what management objectives or challenges we could use this integrated model suite to evaluate. As Joel mentioned at the beginning of this workshop, a year from now, we would like to have demonstrated the utility of the integrated model suite to regional managers and stakeholders through a series of essentially proof of concepts for PSIMF. We have the capacity over the next year to do about 5 management runs across the full model suite, which we recognize is a fairly modest number of management of runs of the full model suite. Therefore, we want to set up with you all today what the priorities are in our minds, and then also elicit from you what your priorities are for these runs that we will pursue in the near term over the next year or so. So what we're asking you to consider is challenges or management interventions that require the full integrated model suite. So things that that we expect will transfer across the terrestrial, freshwater, and marine spheres, and that will leverage the abilities and the capabilities of all of the models in the modeling suite. So there are really interesting management questions that are important for understanding the future of Puget Sound and for moving us towards Puget Sound recovery, but they may not require the use of the full integrated model suite. They may only require the use of 1 or 2 models in this toolbox. But we want to leverage the linking of all 5 of the models to questions that really require that. So that's one of our asks for today in your brainstorming and your discussions. Another ask is that we want to focus on management levers that are relevant regionally over a decade scale. So we have the ability with the PSIMF model suite to model the full Puget Sound basin, and the ability to model out through 2100. So let's focus on large scale with large spatial and temporal scales. Here are some examples of what we see as potential management runs that we could do that leverage this large scale and will have influence over many years. So these examples would build on VELMA's ongoing collaborations with several regional tribes, which have been interested in exploring the ecosystem service outcomes and trade-offs of alternative forest management scenarios. So here are some examples here of ecosystem-based forest management aimed at longer harvest intervals, thinning, and snow gaps. So previous work by the VELMA team found that thinning of older forests in the Tolt River and the Nooksack watersheds could increase summer low flows by 20 to 60%, whereas the thinning of younger forests had a negligible effect on summer low flows. So that's one example of a forest management strategy that we could implement basin-wide. Another would be increasing the harvest intervals. So previous work by the VELMA team found that increasing harvest intervals to greater than 80 years in the Michelle Forest also substantially increased summer low flows. And so that could have a measurable impact if we implemented that longer harvest interval at large scales across the Puget Sound Basin. Another example here is the implementation of snow gaps. So basically creating gaps in the forest that serve to accumulate snow and then results in a slower melting process of that snow. So the VELMA team has advanced their ability to measure these dynamics of snow and the effects of potential implementation of snow gaps with the Nisqually tribe. And they demonstrated through the use of VELMA that implementing snow gaps can effectively retain snowpack into the summer season and therefore extend snow melt, which benefits summer low flows for both spawning and rearing habitats for salmon. So again, looking at regional management applications of the PSIMF model framework that will be influential, but that could be scaled up to regional scales. Another example of this kind of application at larger scales versus focusing on management actions that influence only individual parcels or individual watersheds is something like the Puget Sound Regional Council's open space conservation plan or regional open space strategy. This was a stakeholder engagement process in 2018 where they, PSRC engaged with nonprofits and resource agencies and tribes, as well as other groups to prioritize approximately 463,000 acres of open space for conservation and restoration. So it would be feasible for PSIMF to simulate implementation of this regional open space strategy over the next coming decades by setting aside specific parcels that were identified through this robust stakeholder input, and then model that out into the future. What would it look like if we fully implemented the regional open space strategy from PSRC? On the flip side here, there have been ongoing efforts to install stormwater parks, and groups have said, let's work towards implementing 30 stormwater parks in the coming decade. But the locations for those stormwater parks haven't been identified yet. So that would be a challenge for us to implement a regional application of a stormwater management strategy, because we don't know the specific locations where stakeholders and managers think those stormwater parks should go yet. So having something like the Regional Open Space Network from PSRC, where specific locations have already been identified, would be particularly valuable for us. And just to emphasize that we want to build on existing studies and existing efforts like the PSRC open space plan, or VELMA's existing collaborations with tribes that could be extended beyond the original study area. We could leverage existing or prior efforts like the vital sign implementation strategies, if we can get really specific about what those would look like on the landscape. There's also been existing studies on agricultural nutrient best management practices in the Nooksack River that we think could be scaled up at a basin scale. Basically, we don't want to, nor do we have the time in the next year to recreate the wheel on some of these prioritization and engagement efforts that have already happened. And so we want to instead leverage those existing works and the outcomes from those processes that have already happened and model them, be able to model them at a large scale. So here's a list of our initial brainstorming that our internal PSIMF team has produced for the management runs that we think we could do. We may not necessarily get to all of them in the next year, but we're bringing these to you today as a starting place for discussion. So with the population growth and the climate change scenarios that we've outlined already, we could implement management runs that look at forest management practices, like thinning and snow gaps that I already talked about. Additionally, we could look at the implementation of riparian buffers related to forest management. A second kind of bucket of management runs that we could look at are related to growth management and development, such as tuning up or down population growth, limiting growth to within urban growth areas, or allowing growth to happen without the restriction of urban growth areas, for example. We could look at aspects of agricultural nutrient BMPs, about stormwater and wastewater management, if we can get spatially specific about those. And then also fisheries management. So Hem mentioned that Atlantis is capable of modeling basically fishery catch. And so we could, and hatchery supplementation. And so those are also ripe for implementation. Kind of scenarios around, or management runs around fisheries management are also possible within the PSIMF project. With that, I think we're gonna take a quick pause here to see if there are additional questions. I know there's been a lot of activity in the chat already, but also want to open the floor for verbal questions as well.
Thanks, Caitlin. Appreciate the context both on the integrated modeling framework, but also how we're thinking about applying that. Wanted you all to have a full picture before we kind of dive into that brainstorming. If you have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can have you unmute or drop them in the chat. One thing I'll just add on top of what Caitlin mentioned in terms of these management runs is, while we have capacity for about 5 integrated runs across the entire suite, VELMA does have the ability to do some sensitivity runs to help inform and refine the management runs that we pass to the rest of the models. So for example, if we're looking at snow gaps, they may be able to do some sensitivity runs that look at different densities, look at prioritizing placements based off different theories to help refine and inform. Again, that capacity is not infinite, but something to keep in mind as you're thinking about the sequencing and what would be helpful here. So I don't see any raised hands, but I do see some questions that had good discussion in the chat that I just want to make sure everyone kind of hears and we have an opportunity to discuss further. Kevin, can you just reiterate some of the thoughts around land use and land cover as we're thinking about this over the coming year?
Sure thing. I don't know why my camera is not turning on, and I apologize. I have a contractor here who just tripped to the breaker that went to my computer, so
we
I
can
have
hear
not
you.
been
Is the good
present
news
for the last few minutes, and am having some current technical issues. There's been quite a few questions in the chat about incorporating zoning, or the lack thereof in the land cover change model. And that is a question that comes up very often. While zoning is extremely important to land use, land cover is very distinct from land use. While the two are most certainly related, land cover represents very, very broad classes that can have many different land uses within them. So, and the land cover classes are largely based on impervious surface. And given the broad range of classes, probably the best example I can give is that developed high intensity land cover class represents things that are, or areas that are more than 80% impervious surface. And that can range from a large house on a small lot to port operations. And so because of that large range of potential uses in each land cover class, at this time, there is no mechanism for zoning within the land cover change model. Additionally, putting together a regional zoning map at this time was deemed not feasible for this operation. Though there is another Philip Murphy is developing kind of a simple model to incorporate zoning into that may work in parallel with the land cover change model sometime in
Thanks,
the future.
Kevin. I appreciate that context. And I think, you know, as we think about, therefore, the types of questions and runs that the integrated model is well suited to answer, that means great for some and less so for others. And so helpful context here. Rebecca, I see you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Kevin. That's really helpful. I don't think I put zoning questions in there, but I had them. So I appreciate folks who are asking those questions. I just wanted to let folks know for awareness that the Habitat still is actually has a project we're funding. Well, we're funding the Department of Commerce to do that zoning land classification work throughout the Puget Sound. So they're in process of that right now. I don't remember the timeline for when that was going to be complete. But if that could be pretty helpful, I think in the future to be able to maybe cross-reference or have that mapped out. So I just wanted to let you know that that is something that's actually currently happening.
Those sorts of connections are hugely helpful as we think about refining the management runs and also think about future phases in development and what's relevant moving forward. Derek, would you like to go next?
Thanks. Sorry, my computer's a little slow. Yeah, I think I had some of those zoning questions, and mostly it was because I'm not sure that, like, if we take current trends, that they will hold up over time. So if we're trying to project way out, they're going to start running up against those zoning boundaries. So I'm not sure if we could take current trends and extrapolate them out 80 years or, you know, up to 2080, for example, given that the underlying zoning will start to constrain some of that land cover change.
I think that's a really good caveat to include in all of this, and I appreciate you flagging that. Kevin, anything else you want to add on that front?
No, it's a good call out. The one thing I will say is that there is a lot more developable land than the model is currently showing being developed by 2100. So while zoning may push specific uses to areas, the land cover, there is more than enough room to project forward to 2100 and still have developable land in the Puget Sound Basin. So while zoning may one day be incorporated into this model, currently it is not constraining what the model is able to project forward.
That's useful. Thank you.
Thanks for that context, Kevin. Caitlin, do you want to just speak to the conversation in the chat about combining of scenarios, things like egg BMPs and stormwater in kind of integrated runs?
Yeah, so David put a good question in about whether it was possible to combine management interventions in the same run. So like Mariel just mentioned, combining stormwater BMPs with ag nutrient BMPs. And that is certainly possible. We can definitely set up the management runs through the model to look at combinations of management interventions. But we'd also want to be really careful about how we design those model runs so that we can associate the observed changes in outcomes to with each of the management interventions that are included. So we want to be able to say the influence of the stormwater interventions is X, and the intervention in the influence of the ag BMPs is Y, so that we can understand where the benefits are coming from, as far as which intervention is resulting in the changes that we're observing in the model.
Great, thanks, Caitlin. And Ham, I know there was a lot of follow-up conversation and questions on the salmon front with Atlantis, both in terms of kind of geographic scope, but also in terms of how habitat changes cascade through. Anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that the HARP model is really focusing on restoration actions in the riparian areas. They have not necessarily looked once you get into the estuary. So there, we have ways in Atlantis to model changes in habitat. So, for example, armoring or increasing wetland area that we can translate those changes into different modifiers. I think Shahara had asked about that.
Great, thank you so much. Jeff.
Yes, I'm curious about the source of information on the impact of various marine species in the model. I've had some experience of an effort with the Department of Ecology using the Salish Sea Model, and they were drawing some strong conclusions about the impact on salmon and other species, but it was never clear that what the source of their information of changes in dissolved oxygen and various other factors, what was the actual impact on various marine species. So what's the source here?
So in general, for salmon data, we use a variety of sources to parameterize the functional groups. I will put the link to our technical memorandum in the comments. We probably went the other way, where we have 300 pages of very detailed description of what every parameter was taken from. But in terms of the oxygen, if that's something specific that you're interested about, I don't know if, I think it was in Kaylin's slide about the advancements that we've done in Atlantis. So we've now included oxygen sensitivity as part of our model, and that was also parameterized based on different searches. And I can give you those references. They're not in the tech memo because they're more recent.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Hem. Yeah, I appreciate all of the work you all have done on parameterizing very specific energetic dynamics over the summer. Yeah, even just seeing a little bit of what goes into that, I have a very deep appreciation for the complexity. I saw also questions in the Easy Retro from folks who've been kind of adding in some thoughts there. And Bob, I'm hoping you can kind of speak to this, but just thinking about the resolution of VELMA and how that aligns with exploring riparian buffers. There were some questions and interest and context there.
Yeah, so could you repeat the last part of that question, please?
Yeah, just kind of talking about how VELMA is set up to be able to look at riparian zones and runs, considering the spatial resolution of VELMA.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that will be possibly a large part of what we do to affect stream temperature for HARP and ultimately Atlantis. And so what we're able to do at a 30-meter grid scale with VELMA is to locate where we want to put buffers, where they will be most effective. And that's, typically done for a whole watershed that we're interested in. That Snohomish is one of the first places what we're trying to do that. So we can vary buffer width by, for example, 30 meters or no buffers, all the way up to maybe 60 or even 90 meters, just to look at that. And one of the things that we're interested in is the effect of riparian shade on groundwater, near surface groundwater, that along flow paths will create various locations, cold water refuges for salmon to take refuge in, especially during climate change. So we have a report coming out on that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you, Bob. Any other questions that folks would like to raise? Otherwise, we'll transition to a break before we go into the very interactive brainstorming portion of this. Jennifer, go for it.
Sorry, several buttons. Good morning.
No worries.
Thanks for this overview and obviously a huge amount of hard work. I think, not to be addressed maybe right now, but something I'd really love to see is the future scenarios group, this piece of group and the action agenda indicators group coming together and building a schematic for all of us as to how do these efforts interrelate? How do they address different questions, or how can they address like different scales of questions? How can the efforts be leveraged? Because I think when I've listened in these different conversations, I see a lot of overlap, recognizing there's also probably a lot of nuance in the details. And so really understanding how to give inputs into each of these efforts and how they're leveraging each other would be super helpful. And then I think we'll get to this in the brainstorm, but I'm super interested in seeing management runs that are really tied as they can, as appropriate for the scale of the model and et cetera, to existing conversations that are being had by managers with real policy alternatives on the table or real areas of policy disagreement, and being very specific about that, so that there is that interaction. And I think that'll require some additional conversations with, I'm not in those rooms, but additional conversations with the folks in those rooms.
Completely agree. This is not the end of a conversation. And I think what this helps us do is kind of narrow in on what are those conversations, what are those communities that we need to engage with further. So for example, if from today we hear that riparian buffers is something that we should be focusing on over the next year, there are a lot of groups already having discussions about updating guidance on riparian buffers, and they will be next on our list then to talk with further. But it helps us kind of narrow in on where to have those follow-up conversations. Joel, do you want to speak to kind of that collaboration more broadly?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer, for that comment. I mean, I think that's exactly what we're trying to do here today. We don't pretend to be smart enough to understand everything that's going on in the Puget Sound region, nor are we the ones who are going to design these strategies. But we know that, a number of groups around the region have for a long time been pursuing the working model is that we can change what we change in the landscape is going to affect the functioning and quality of the Puget Sound ecosystem, right? That's kind of the baseline of what most of us do. And this tool is designed to help explore the options there. And I think this is, as a reminder, the tool is much more, in my view, valuable using it heuristically to look at the relative efficacy impact of different strategies, as opposed to being a projective model. I want to know exactly what this is going to look like in the year 2100, right? But I would hope that you get excited about this and that we can have this conversation continue into the future, so that a year from now we're really doing this matchmaking of who's thinking hard about forest management. I mean, there's obviously a ton of people in the region who do that. Who's thinking hard about hatcheries, not to touch the third rail right away in the morning, but there's just these things, right, that everyone is working on really hard, and we're not pretending that that's us. We're pretending like we want to know those. We're not pretending. We want to know those people. So we want to work collaboratively a year from now. And we want to be building something that it kind of resonates with you, Jennifer, and others. Like, yeah, okay, you're hitting my mark, not like you're an academic off in the corner and like, I don't know what to do with that. Or we're modeling some scenarios like, yeah, you're never going to do that, right? So this is all part of the ongoing conversation. I think the exciting thing about the modeling activity is it the framework to help us have those conversations. And just while I'm talking, the other point is, yes, we talk a lot with the Future Scenarios Project and other modeling groups in the region to coordinate across. And they're nuanced. They're not exactly, it's a portfolio, right? So there's strengths and having different models. So.
I'll just echo that I really appreciate the insights that John and Elizabeth, who are on the call, have shared on the future scenario as we've been moving forward with this, and definitely a lot of ongoing conversations to be had about what that looks also beyond the current project there. Any final questions before we go to break? And Scott, I do see your question about open source code. I think we will take that as a follow up because I suspect that each model has different perspectives on that. And so I will follow up with you based off that question.
And if I could just, before we break, add a quick clarification on sort of the conversation in the chat. When we say, we kind of run out of words when we talk about this stuff. So when we say 5 runs, we don't mean like we're going to push go on a piece of software 5 times and that's all we can do during the year. It means that there's 5 areas, there's 5 sort of lines of investigation we think we can pursue over the next 12-month period. So don't think of this as like we have to like optimize and just like, oh my gosh, you can only right, we have 5 nickels to put in the slot machine and we got to really be careful which nickels we put in, right? So it's more focusing in on how are we going to spend a couple months at a time evaluating the efficacy of forest management. How, what should we be doing there? Ditto for urban land use planning or whatever you all choose at the end of the next 2-hour period. So I just wanted to clarify that point. We're somewhat limited by computer power and stuff, but we're really limited by time. And we need to focus so that at the end of it, we have products that are definitive enough so that you can understand, it illustrates the utility of the modeling.
Okay, that Joel. I do want to, before we break, touch on this question, which is about hindcasts and the feasibility of that. Caitlin, do you want to speak to that briefly?
Yeah, I was just starting to type a reply to you, Dan, in the chat, but yeah, I mean it's certainly something that we've talked about as a group, and obviously there's distinct value in doing a hindcast and saying, like the examples that you threw out there, what would salmon and orca populations look like if we, if we hadn't taken these actions that have occurred over the last 200 years. The challenge, though, is that, the performance of these models depends on having observations to compare to so that we know that the models are performing and are kind of matching our observations correctly. And we don't necessarily have the observations in nutrients and freshwater flow and certain fish populations going back into the past in order to validate the model performance in the same way that we can in the near term, the last several decades. So some of that is, while it would be distinctly valuable, some of the models are limited in their ability to do a hindcast. Anything?
Yeah, Paula, can I respond
yeah.
to that quickly, or should we save it for later?
Go for it, Dan.
I appreciate that, and perhaps that's the wrong term. I am professionally wrong about guessing the future all the time. That's sort of what I'm qualified to do. But I think that in some contexts, funding policy type contexts, having a better version of the counterfactual of the absence of work that we're doing is really valuable. And in some ways it's more valuable for people who know that they're making risk decisions under uncertainty for the future. I'm less concerned with a really cleanly validated hindcast than I am with what would an Arcadian Puget Sound have looked like if we roll forward. What would a fully industrialized Puget Sound have looked like relative to where we are? We're gonna only be able to calibrate to the world that we've seen, but using this lab, this in silico lab, to help people have a clearer picture of where we might be now had we not been doing things. And so that's not a strict hindcast. It's not a clean attribution run, but I think it's easier sometimes for people to think about the world around them right now, how it might have looked differently. I don't know. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Dan. Thanks for clarifying your thinking there. And I guess, so one of the model runs that we weren't going to talk about today because we already are in the process of doing it because we know we need to anyways, is a projection forward of that high climate change scenario, high emission scenario for climate change, and status quo change in land cover resulting from the kind of projections for population growth out into the future with no additional management. Like if we just keep doing exactly what we have been doing and project that out into the future, what will the species and systems of Puget Sound look like? And so that at least is kind of a status quo scenario to which we can compare what if we do X, what if we do X and Y. So that doesn't get at exactly, I think, what we were talking about, but represents a future of, let's pretend that we don't do anything more than what we're doing right now. And what does that future look like? So that's, maybe one example of a way of representing that future where we don't recognize that we probably need to be doing more than we are right now.
And I think the idea of counterfactuals really resonates with me. And an example that we've talked about is to run the land cover change model and remove urban growth areas influence. And I think that's a nice way, to your point, Dan, to say the contrast of if we didn't act in a certain way.
Yeah, I responded negatively to that in the board thinking forward because it's so implausible that what's the value. But I think that thinking that those same words here is actually works quite nicely for me. So that's what I'm getting towards. Thank you.
Cool. Appreciate that. All right, we're going to take one last question from Paul, which is, to what extent is this modeling effort intended to guide future data collection? Joel, you want to speak to that one?
I will at a high level. I think the reason for having good models and good monitoring is they work together and they work interactively. And yeah, absolutely, this is the tool, like all the other models available in the region, to allow you to fine tune your data collection. So this identifies where the gaps are, not just data, but sort of conceptual understanding. Like, do we really understand the relationship between, I'll pick on something, tree thinning and groundwater flow? Like, do we understand that well enough? It's in the model, but is that the weak link? Is that where we need to go? So yeah, absolutely. I think this is part of that.
Great. Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for your time today. I really appreciate it. It's as I started saying, it's an important time for our group, for this program. And we see this as the beginning of conversations with you all, and hopefully we won't annoy you too much, but we certainly are going to ping on you again for more guidance along the way. We are up on the screen. I think you can see kind of our rough time specifically for this project. And again, let me emphasize the project is our current funding, but the work will go on forever probably. But just this kind of puts the bounds on it. So we will be between now and then really through the holiday season, we'll be refining what we call the final management runs. That's probably a bad terminology. Our next set of management runs with the stakeholders, with a goal of having that work completed and packaged and communicated in a way that would be available to all of you and your colleagues, so that we can share that and demonstrate the utility of the effort that we have ongoing, and begin to or continue to develop those relationships with the user community. And then we have we didn't introduce everybody. We have a talented group of scientists, including some really killer postdocs that are doing a lot of the really innovative work on this, and they'll continue to work through into the 2026 calendar year in writing things and doing presentations and things of that nature. So that's kind of our schedule. You will be hearing from us again. We will definitely follow up short term with the results of this workshop today, so you can kind of see what the collective wisdom that came out of that. And I look forward to further conversations with all of you. Caitlin, do you have anything to add? As the co-conspirator here.
Yeah, just want to echo the gratitude for your time today. I know 3 hours is a big chunk of time to ask, and so we really appreciate your engagement and the helpful discussions that happened in my breakout room, and I'm sure in the others as well. And just to acknowledge that, you know, this is a big team. Again, we didn't get to introduce everyone who's involved in this project, but you can see our partnering agencies and funding agencies listed on this slide here. So it's a really great team, and we all are excited to continue working with you over the next year or so.